to our Memorial Presents public forum dealing with long-distance commuting and its consequences. I'd like to welcome both those of you who are here with me in the Bruno Center for Innovation and Research on the campus of Memorial University, and those who are watching on the internet. So it's my great pleasure to welcome you here today. My name is Mike Clare. I'm the Associate Director for Public Policy at the Harris Center, and it's my great pleasure to be your host here this evening. In a few minutes, I'll invite my co-host, Dr. Barb Neese, to introduce this event, but I'm going to briefly outline how this event will unfold here tonight. So our event is going to be in two parts. The first part is going to be a series of presentations. We have 7 well-known experts on the topic who will each speak for 7 minutes. And so I'm going to time them to make sure that they keep to their time, because our objective is to keep the second hour free for your questions and your comments. So for those of you who are here with me, we will circulate a couple of wireless microphones. We want the people watching on the internet to be able to hear your question or your comment. So simply raise your hand, we'll get the microphone over to you. For those of you who are watching on the internet, you will see a Twitter handle and an email address. Feel free to send us a comment or a question that way, and we'll have somebody here read that question or comment to the audience and have our panel address it. The discussion session is going to be moderated by my colleague at the Harris Center, Dr. Rob Greenwood, the Executive Director of the Office of Public Engagement and the Harris Center. Just as the presenters are going to be as succinct as possible with their comments, I would ask you also, when you're making a comment or asking a question, to be as succinct as possible so we can get as many comments or questions in. This session will be archived on the Harris Center's website in a day or so. So if you want to tell your friends about it, or if you want to re-see your excellent question that you asked, you can go to our Harris Center afterwards. So now it's my great pleasure to introduce Dr. Barb Neese, the co-director of the Safety Net Center for Occupational Health and Safety Research and project director for the Safety Net Center's On the Move partnership, to give you the context for tonight's session and to introduce our panelists. Barb.
Thank you, Mike, and thanks everyone for coming out tonight. It's great to see you here, and I hope there's lots of people listening in on the web as well. So tonight we're launching a new partnership that's based at Memorial University, but is pan-Canadian in terms of its involvement, and also involves some researchers from other countries in the world as well. That partnership we're calling the On the Move Partnership. It's a 7-year research program funded with over $5 million of cash and in-kind support from the Social Sciences and Humanities Research Council, the Newfoundland and Labrador Research Development Corporation, Canada Foundation for Innovation, Memorial, and multiple other universities and community partners. Memorial Safety Net Center for Occupational Health and Safety Research is the lead institution inside of Memorial, but we have 42 co-applicant researchers from 17 disciplines and 22 universities involved. We also have 36 partner organizations, 11 academic, and 25 community. So what's the On the Move partnership all about? Well, basically, we're going to carry out a program of research looking at what we're calling the spectrum of mobility, the spectrum of different types of extended commuting within Canada, so daily commutes from 2 to 3 hours a day, to often prolonged periods of absence in other regions, other provinces, and outside of Canada, and we're including in our spectrum of mobility workers who come into Canada and are employed in our industries. And we're doing that quite deliberately because we have many industries in Canada today where you could have people working in that industry who are from that adjacent community, people who are commuting in from outside communities, people who are coming from other provinces, other parts of the country, and in fact are coming in as temporary foreign workers. And they could be in the same workplace doing probably different jobs, but perhaps not. So why a research partnership to look at this? Well, what we're calling employment-related geographical mobility, or again, extended commuting, is a particularly pervasive part of life in northern resource-dependent areas. We know that very much here in Newfoundland and Labrador. It's a very big feature of our economy. I think anybody knows somebody who's commuting somewhere in this province for work, and that includes within the province, whether it's from here to Long Harbour, or if it's Conception Bay into St. John's, or it's from the west coast of Newfoundland to work up on Conception Bay in a fish plant, and so on. So it's a very pervasive, it's very, very evident in our lives, and that's true, I think, throughout the north and throughout resource-dependent communities. But it's also obviously a big issue in large urban centers. I think the average commute time in Toronto now is somewhere between 70 to 80 minutes a day. Well, it doesn't take you very long before you start to get into 1.5 hours to 2 hours, and that's in one direction, that 70 to 80 minutes. So it's an issue there, and of course, even in places like Southern Ontario, where we've had deindustrialization, places like Montreal, we have a lot of people who are joining the extended commute industry, if you like, or travel spectrum out of the province and into other regions in order to find work. So it's happening all over the place. And it has the potential to affect Canadian prosperity, we've argued in our proposal, by influencing local labor markets. So basically, we've got, to some degree in this country, a spatial mismatch between where people are living, the skills that they have, and where the work is happening. Sometimes people solve that by moving, but a lot of people are solving it, at least in the short term, by commuting. It can affect work schedules and intensity. So if you're away from home for 2 weeks at a time, you don't want to be hanging around doing nothing on the weekends. You want to basically be making as much money as possible. So extended commuting can really have quite serious consequences in terms of how work is scheduled and the intensity of that work. It might affect absenteeism, it could affect labor turnover, we don't know, that hasn't really been studied. It can affect real incomes, who's paying the cost of the commute? You know, and how is it affecting your insurance and so on. Obvious work-life balance issues, so consequences for family members potentially. Again, the mobility of one member of the family has the potential to affect the ability of the other member of the family, let's say the spouse who's at home, to engage in mobility themselves. It affects where people spend their money, and this is not well studied here. It's certainly well studied, better studied internationally in terms of remittances, but so do people who work in Alberta buy on the internet, buy in Alberta, buy in St. John's. Where do they actually do their Christmas shopping if we want to get to the season? It has potential to affect social equality, basically. Again, there are potential gender effects if we move into a society that's more and more requires people to commute long distances, and there are potential consequences for health, including occupational health. So if we simply look at this province, extended commuting's been in the media pretty well nonstop for the last year. So we have the controversy over fly-in, fly-out workers for Lab City, the Happy Valley Goose Bay work camp proposal basically abandoned because people were not sure they wanted a work camp in the city or in the town. Tim Hortons in Deer Lake is talking about bringing in temporary foreign workers, concerns about the Alberta lifestyle, wasting lives, that was in the press. Municipalities near Hebron expressing concern about the effects of that oil and gas development adjacent to their communities in terms of affordable housing, evictions, and basic infrastructure. Long Harbour plant needs more workers, so we get a whole story about bringing in a ship and anchoring it in the harbor so that they can meet their labor needs, and concerns about the potential labor shortages in our brand new aquaculture industry on the south coast, and of course the story in the summer about Thai workers being brought into seafood processing up on the Bayburt Peninsula. So they're all, it's everywhere in this province as we look around. So what are the objectives of this partnership? Well, we want to develop an enhanced understanding of the extent, the mechanisms, and the impacts of extended commuting in Canada. We want to help improve the capacity of Canadian companies, unions, governments, communities, families, and individuals to develop innovative and appropriate practices that maximize the benefits of extended commuting where it has to happen while minimizing its negative consequences. We'd like to turn Memorial in Canada into an international leader in research in this area, and we'd like to lay the foundations for a larger international research program on the spectrum of mobility. So we'll examine policies that contribute to extended commuting in this country and that influence how it affects employers, workers and their families, the communities where they live, and the communities where they work. We'll explore who engages in what kinds of mobility, and the distribution of different kinds of mobility across different sectors. A lot of the research has looked at only one sector, only one type of mobility. We're going to look at a whole bunch of sectors: construction, fisheries, the health sector, mining, oil and gas, shipping, tourism, transportation, trucking are some of the areas that we're going to look at. We're interested in who takes up mobility and how, so the entrance into mobility. How does that happen? We know often it's chain migration. My parents do it, and then you take your child along, and so on and so forth. But how does it happen? And then we're also interested in who leaves and why they leave. If you exit from mobility by moving, so you buy a house so you don't have to commute anymore, or if you exit because of illness, because of layoff, because you get fired, or whatever, we want to know why people are giving it up. So that's the essence of the project, and what we're going to do tonight is we're going to launch this program of research really with a panel of people who are involved with this partnership. And they're going to speak, because we're just starting this research. Obviously, they're not presenting on the results of our findings. What they're going to talk about is research that they've already done, or issues that they think really require some attention. So I'm going to introduce our panelists, and then they'll just speak one after the other. So our first speaker is Nora Spinks. She's the Chief Executive Officer of the Vanier Institute of the Family, and they're a partner with the On the Move Partnership. For more than 25 years, Nora has worked with progressive organizations, helping business, labor, government, and community leaders to create effective, productive, and supportive work environments, to strengthen families, and to build healthy communities. Dr. Sarah DeRoe, next to her, is an associate professor of sociology at the University of Alberta, so we're moving this way along that row, in case you haven't sorted out the gender. And she teaches and conducts research in the areas of globalization, race and culture, gender and family, qualitative methods, and the idea of community, and she's been doing research in Fort McMurray now for some time. Dr. Pauline Gardner-Barber is a professor and head of the Department of Sociology and Social Anthropology at Dalhousie, and she's completed research on a multitude of different regions and has done extensive research on Filipina and Filipino workers in Canada. Dr. Michael Hann is an associate professor and Canada Research Chair in Population and Social Policy at the University of New Brunswick, and he'll be heading up the statistical component of the On the Move Partnership, and his research interests include demography, immigrant settlement, labor market integration, and residential segregation. Next to him is Greg Halseth, a professor in the Geography program at the University of Northern British Columbia and a Canada Research Chair in Rural and Small Town Studies. He's also the director of the University of British Columbia's Community Development Institute, and he's been looking at mobile workers for some time and at rural and economic development strategies and issues in northern British Columbia. Next to him is Martha MacDonald, a professor and past chair of the Department of Economics at St. Mary's, and she's done extensive research on labor market restructuring, gender and economics, household livelihood strategies, and income security policy. And then our final speaker is Dr. David Walters, a professor of work environment and director of the Cardiff Work Environment Research Center at Cardiff University. And David's been involved in a major study related to basically to regulatory enforcement inside the European Union, whereas I think many of you would know we have extensive levels of migrant work happening. So that's our panelist. You're up, Nora.
Very much. It's a pleasure to be here. I'm going to be setting the context for our conversations this evening, and I want to begin by sort of setting the stage. And I thought the best way to do this with only 7 minutes on the panel is to engage you in a little human graphing exercise, if you don't mind. And all this requires is for you to stand up. So you need to put all your papers on the ground and just stand up for me for a second. And all I need you to do is raise your right hand if you currently have any children in your life. This could be your own child, a grandchild, a niece and nephew, any children in your life whatsoever, raise your right hand. If any one of these children are under the age of 6, between the ages of 13 and 19, currently attending post-secondary or recently moved back home, Make that arm go up and down. Rest of you keep them up high. If you have anybody in your life over the age of 55, raise your left hand. This could be a spouse, a parent, a grandparent, anybody over the age of 55. If any one of those persons over the age of 55 lives more than 10 kilometers away from you, recently hospitalized, diagnosed with any kind of chronic illness, disability, make that arm go up and down. If you've experienced any kind of change in your work environment, new boss, new priorities, new funding, raise your right leg. If you provide any kind of support, direction, assistance, mentoring, guidance to anybody who's experienced change in their work environment, make that leg go up and down. If you're involved in volunteering in your community, raise your other leg. And if you wished at any time in the last week that there was more than 24 hours in a day, just give me a neck roll. And back again. Thanks a lot. Have a seat. So I take you through that little exercise to demonstrate a couple things. First of all, to keep you awake for the rest of the panel, but two, to identify how dynamic and how diverse the experiences are of Canadian families across this country. And if I were to ask you the same set of questions 5 years ago or 5 years from now, they may be a little bit different. But nonetheless, it's very energetic, it's very dynamic. And families today are the most agile, most flexible, most adaptable institution in our societies. Now, just to give you a couple of numbers, here in Newfoundland, there's been about a 1.8% growth in population since 2006, which is reversing the trend from the past. And by the way, that's about 2 times the growth rate of Nova Scotia. The median age here in Newfoundland is 44, which is about 4 years, 3.5 years higher than anywhere else in Canada. The fastest growing population is over the age of 65, and between 80 and 90% of those, as you get older, 80 to 90% of those actually live alone. Right now in Canada, there's over 5,835 centenarians living in Canada. So we have the very old are getting very old. And at the same time, we have to recognize that those persons over the age of 65 are providing a lot of the care for adults. And on average, they're putting in about 60 volunteer hours per year across the country. We have over 9 million families in Canada, which is an increase of about 5.5%. In Newfoundland, here you have 160,000 families, and they're very diverse families. About 67% of them in 2011 were married. 50 years ago, that would have been 90%. Now, we have a 14% increase in the number of common law families. We've also seen about an 8% increase in the number of lone parent families over the course of the last 5 years, which is about 10% of all families. But the fastest growing trend in lone parent families is a 16% increase in the number of lone parent families led by men. Now, we've also seen a dramatic increase, statistically speaking, in the number of same-sex couples right now in Canada. The latest Statistics Canada, because it was our first full 5-year period of legal same-sex marriage in the country, we saw an increase of 42%. Well, at least we think it's 42%, but in fact, some of the data coming out of Alberta, where 2 men were living together and both indicated that they were married, the assumption was that they were married to each other, when in fact a large proportion of them were actually married to women here in Atlantic Canada. So we're not quite sure how that's going to shake down, but we're working on it. 39% of all couples have children. The vast majority of those are in 2-paycheck households, either one adult with 2 paychecks or 2 paychecks, 1 adult each. We have more fathers actively involved with their children than ever before. 75% of today's dads have indicated that they're spending more time with their kids than their dads spent on them. We now have, both in Newfoundland here, we have about 50% of families living in census metropolitan areas, 50% living outside. One of the fastest growing increases are those households of one person. Right now, about 22% in Newfoundland live in one-person households. In 1961, that was only 4%. And the reverse is so with 5-person plus households, are now only 5% of families, whereas in 61 it was 50%, or half the families. Right now, we're seeing, other than Princess Kate, there are still other people around the world who are having babies, and you are having lots of them here in Newfoundland, about 5,000 babies born last year. The number of teen pregnancies is down dramatically, down almost 37% in a 5-year period, which is enormous, and we're happy to see that. We're seeing right now in Newfoundland a slight decrease in the number of 20 to 29-year-olds who are living with their parents. You were the highest in the country in 2006 with about 51% of 20 to 29-year-olds living with their parents. That's dropped down a little bit to about 45%. In Canada, we provide a lot of care through family members. About 26% of men and about 31% of women, 45 and over, are actively providing care. That's about just over 500,000 Canadians providing care to other adults. Unemployment with 15 to 24-year-olds was only about 48%, so less than half of those folks were actually employed last summer. We're seeing families still spending a fair amount of their family income on food. In Newfoundland, it was almost $7,000 a year in food. But 69% of Newfoundlanders are considered obese, which is about a little more than 10% more than the rest of the province. You still have some bad habits, almost double the number of heavy drinkers, male heavy drinkers in Newfoundland than anywhere else in the country. But it's not all bad news. There is a lot of activity amongst families here, a lot of tremendous support from one family to the other as families are experiencing serial single parenting as a result of employment mobility. So it's been an interesting journey in sort of setting the foundation for the rest of the panelists, and I look forward to the conversation later on this evening. Sarah, thanks.
Well, I'll continue the fun. How many of you know someone who's living and or working in Fort McMurray in the oil sands? Okay, and if you are related to that person, wave. Okay, all right, thank you. See, I didn't make you stand up, but it was still fun. I'm really glad to be here and be part of this panel and a part of this wonderful project on the move. In the short time that I have today, I want to briefly address how oil and mobility collide and collude to shape the social and cultural landscape, especially in Fort McMurray where I do my research. That I do not even have to explain to you where or what Fort McMurray is, tells you, I think, how incredibly powerful it is in the meeting of oil and mobile work in Canada and globally. And especially given that half of all outbound mobile workers from Newfoundland and Labrador go to Alberta each year. And increasing numbers are coming back this way, as you know. In fact, after several years of doing research in Fort McMurray, I've come to think of mobility as its own kind of social actor, that it really has a real impact on life. And it's literally built into the infrastructure in Fort McMurray, into airstrips and work camps and roadways. But then that's really only the most obvious layer of where oil and mobile work intersect. Because it exerts a social force, for better or for worse, on family life, experiences of time, workplace dynamics, how communities can survive or thrive or even be imagined. In my 30-minute cab ride to the Edmonton airport yesterday, I learned that my cab driver came to Canada at the age of 18 from East Africa, itself immersed in oil geopolitics, by way of a 6-month stint in Saudi Arabia, where his brother had migrated to work in an oil company. After many years in Toronto, he moved to Alberta a couple of years ago. His family lived in Edmonton while he commuted back and forth to drive cab in Fort McMurray. That lasted only a year before he and his family decided that they didn't want to do that anymore, and he moved back to Edmonton. This is a reminder that the marriage of oil and employment-related mobility is a global story. By most accounts, oil is the most valuable global commodity. And as the Canadian Association of Petroleum Producers often reminds us, it creates jobs. But many of those are mobile jobs. This is for a variety of reasons globally, ranging from the needs for large number of workers in short periods of time, including boom and bust cycles, to the often remote locations of deposits, to intensified disparities between those who control the rights to oil extraction and distribution and those who do the labor. In Saudi Arabia, where my cab driver had worked, or his brother had, some 35% of the population is composed of foreign migrant workers. In the United Arab Emirates, that goes up to 91%. In Fort McMurray, the so-called shadow population makes up around 25% of the population, or around 25,000 people. And that's in the whole region, the oil sands region. Of those mobile workers in the oil sands from out of province, more than 20% are from Newfoundland and Labrador. And when you include the Maritimes, workers from Atlantic Canada account for over half. That number does not include people who are mobile workers working outside of the oil sands sector, so in retail and service and health and other areas. In fact, there are many hundreds of mobile workers in the retail and service sector as well, working in live-in caregivers, as nurses, et cetera, and they come from all across Canada and the world. There are some 60 languages spoken in Fort McMurray. So this takes me to a couple of examples from my research. I wish I could give you many more, but I'll just kind of give you a taste, that illustrate how the particular context of such a large resource extraction industry, what some people call the oil sands mega program, has different and layered effects on different subsectors of the population. So take, for instance, the simple fact of the distance from town to the various mining and in situ work sites scattered across northeast Alberta. This makes not only for direct fly-in, fly-out via airstrips, but also for lots of long-distance daily or weekly or monthly commutes. And the distance from Fort McMurray out to site is anywhere from 30 minutes to several hours. But there are kind of ripple effects of this within the community. We found, for example, that these long commutes had some immobilizing effects on women and families. So for families who lived in Fort McMurray, many women decided not to work out at site, even if they had the skills and the interest, because the commute took them too far away from where their children were. This has certainly been found other places as well. And because there's almost no part-time work in the oil industry. Or, given the commute plus the cost of housing, many dual-income oil sands households hired temporary foreign workers from the Philippines as live-in caregivers. So you have layers of mobile workers and mobility, I should say, on top of each other. And of course, for families in Fort McMurray and families who are at a distance from mobile workers who work there, there was the difficulty of adjusting, to what many of our interviewees, and I'm sure many of you have heard of this, called daddy time. When daddy comes home, either after long work days or after 10 days or 2 weeks or 2 months out at site. So that adjustment time is a very difficult time for families, and both men and women talked about the difficulty of that. We also found some other interesting kind of ripple effects of this kind of layering of different forms of mobility. For example, there's a lot of precision time management of the daily routine of shift work and multiple long-distance commutes involving literally hundreds and hundreds of buses going out every day at very particular times. And this has repercussions for multicultural accommodation. So many Muslim Canadians who have moved to Fort McMurray as drivers in the oil sands were frustrated that the busy company couldn't seem to accommodate their prayer schedule, even when they got special dispensation from the imam to be a little flexible about it, right? So this kind of measurement of time and space that really has an effect on workers and their cultural and social rights. Some other immigrant workers felt that they had a hard time kind of breaking in into working in the kind of better paying oil sands jobs, in part because in the construction companies sometimes there were these kind of chain migrations of mobile workers where people were hiring people they knew, and so people who didn't have that kind of social network were kind of left out of that mobile worker chain as well. So some of those same drivers were frustrated they couldn't get the better jobs in the oil sands. There are a number of other things that I could go into. So, for example, there are not just layers of impacts on different workers, different kind of subsectors of workers and mobility, but waves of diverse mobile workers who've been made mobile by oil economies elsewhere. So, for example, a lot of Venezuelans now working in Fort McMurray who came after Chavez had nationalized the oil company, and they were on the political outs, and so were actively recruited and have moved to Fort McMurray to work. We could also look at how, and we aren't going to debate Dutch disease today, but we could certainly talk about and think about how it is that the oil economy has an effect on workers in Ontario and Quebec who become mobile workers and come in wave to Fort McMurray, where again, kind of language and cultural accommodations for Francophones have been very slow. I'm also interested in how some segments of mobile workers supplement the work of other mobile workers. I'm also interested in the differential experiences of and possibilities for even imagining or finding community when you have so many layers of mobility and such a diverse population. So with that, I'll leave it, and I'll look forward to the Q&A with all of you. Thank you.
Okay, gee, there's lots of interesting synergies across the papers, and it's sort of hard. The further down the row, I'm sure it's going to be hard. So tonight I want to contribute a transnational perspective to our discussion of employment-related mobility. For close to 20 years now, I've been working in Philippine communities, thinking about the impacts of Filipino global migration, and I came to that through an interest in Philippine livelihood projects in coastal communities, which where there was severe depletion of resources and also endemic poverty, and that makes for some interesting parallels between the case of Newfoundland and the case of Philippines, but I'm not really going to dwell on those particularly. The geography and sheer size of international migration in the Philippine experience is what I want to briefly highlight, the ways in which forms of labor migration Filipinos are compelled to take up forms of labor migration, and how this becomes invisible, actually, from the Canadian side. For example, in Canada's immigration and citizenship policy, and to members of the communities that receive Filipinos as temporary foreign workers or as new immigrants. Canada's immigration policy is undergoing a major restructuring exercise, with various details being announced by Minister Jason Kenney every few weeks. Incremental changes had been underway for the last decade, resulting in a confusing array of over 50 immigration streams. The diversification of immigration pathways results in large measure from the federal government's devolution of immigration selection to provincial and territorial government nominee programs. Under these arrangements, quotas are negotiated, but provinces gain flexibility to manage their immigration agendas with greater and lesser degrees of success, less so in the initial experiences of provinces in the Atlantic region, unfortunately. Provinces and territories are increasingly concerned about demographic issues such as rural population decline, an aging population in need of care worker support, and in some sectors we are told there is a need for, there are labour shortages in key industries. So provinces are pressing for more control over immigration. However, Kenney insists on maintaining the status quo relative to provincial quotas and the overall immigration numbers. So he's keeping permanent residents at around 250,000, while at the same time increasing temporary foreign workers and privileging immigrants who come with investment capital or highly regarded in-demand skills. As part of immigration reform, Kenney cancelled 280,000 skilled worker applications for immigrants waiting to come to Canada, many of whom in that immigration queue had been there for 6 years or more. The minister explained this is all about getting to a faster system. Media reports of this sort of pointed out, the dramatic nature and radical nature of this reform. So I describe these changes as just-in-time immigration, in a way referring to sort of industrial production models which are calibrated to match market demand with production schedules, all the while rendering the situation for the labor force to be more precarious and flexible. Sorry, going up and down. I'm asking in my just-in-time immigration research, what are the impacts of these Canadian immigration system reforms, just-in-time immigration, on immigrant workers from the Philippines? And what I'm interested in is not just those who are in the queue now, but those who were intending to immigrate, who will find the most appropriate migration pathway they can to enter into Canada. And what we often find in the Filipino immigrants to Canada, in the who've come in through different pathways, whether they're in the temporary foreign worker stream or in as permanent residents and skilled workers and such, that people are carving out their migration pathways to match their understandings of labor market conditions in Canada. And what we are finding, what I found is that most people are entering Canada bearing a lot more skill and contributing a lot more value to their employers than they are receiving in wages. So I have examples in my work of doctors who have requalified to come into the country as nurses, trained RNs who requalify to enter the country to work as practical nurses and live-in caregiver workers. And there are veterinarians working as workers in hog barns in Manitoba, and so on and so forth. I'm deviating from the script a little here. Let me tell you a little bit about the Philippines now. Globally, there are 240 million migrants living or working outside their home countries. The Philippines currently ranks in the top tier of this global phenomenon. Government documents project that approximately 9 million Filipinos are currently to be found in over 190 to 200 countries and territories, 47% living as permanent residents elsewhere. Officially processed overseas foreign workers comprise 45% of the total, while estimates for irregular and undocumented migrants make up the final 8%. In 2010, the Philippines displaced China and India to become Canada's top immigration source country. In that year, permanent resident arrivals numbered 36,580, up from 11,000 in 2002, and Filipino temporary foreign workers surpassed permanent residents' arrivals in 2012 for a total of 45,941, up from 10,000, nearly 11,000 in 2002. The pattern was sustained in 2011. I rest my case about the shift to reliance on temporary workers, some of whom will be in a position to transfer through the Canadian experience class to regular economic immigration streams, but not without serving time in the more precarious temporary labor slots. So, in conclusion, I hope I've left you with a curiosity about the experiences of the migrant Filipinos who are arriving in Canadian communities in such great numbers. Curiosity about their motivations, what images of Canada compelled them to commence on such a bold journey, and how we have lived up to their expectations. At what cost do they travel, and why do they take on the difficulties of such a dramatic undertaking, and how do they manage their fragmented family lives? How might we contribute to making their transition or their travels more just? And a lot of the issues that Sarah spoke of just now, of course, are multiplied across the distance and difficulties of travel for Philippine migrants, no matter how they enter into Canada. Thank you.
good evening, everyone. I'm the lead for the statistical component of the project, and I'd just like to start by saying I'm very pleased to have, and honored to have that role, in part because I'm very interested in the subject matter, but also I get to work with people like Peter Sinclair, Deirdre Walsh, Stephanie Premji, and Wen Chi. Wen Chi is a postdoc that I recently hired. She's starting in January and has not yet done anything, so my account today will be high on anecdotes, and I won't have a lot of real information coming out yet. But stay tuned. Prior to moving to the University of New Brunswick, I was at the University of Alberta, and some of my colleagues, former colleagues, sort of rib me a little bit because they say, you know, I went from the quintessential have province to the quintessential have not province. And I think it's interesting to think about it that way on an economic platform. But if you want to look demographically, which is what I'm more want to do, you could almost make the opposite argument. The contributions that a place like New Brunswick, Newfoundland, and several other provinces have made to the overall Canadian economy, I think are noteworthy, and I believe that part of what I'd like to do with the statistical component is tell that side of the story. So I'm excited to be part of this project for multiple reasons. Most of all, I'm very fascinated by the subject of human migration. Whether it be for work, love, money, or some combination of these things, I think it's interesting to sort of plot out the decisions that individuals make and try to understand their underlying motivations for these decisions. On my way to St. John's yesterday, I was lucky enough to sit beside a 35-year-old man who told me that for the last 15 years, he has not lived in the same region for more than 2 years. When I asked him why he made the decision to move, he assured me that it was not for money, and in fact, he told me that he often lost money when he was changing jobs or moving across provinces or countries. And after 2 hours, or nearly 2 hours, a fairly constant conversation, the man finally conceded that he didn't really know why he was moving as often as he was. He said, well, I guess my parents were part of the military growing up, and maybe that's why I'm moving around as often as I do. And he sort of walked off the plane thinking about why he was making the choices that he was. And I think it was interesting to go through this exercise, not because I'm trying to break his spirit or anything like that. It may have sounded that way, but people do a lot of really important life-changing decisions without fully understanding and taking a step back sometimes and thinking about why it is that they do these things. So I'm excited to be part of a project that will start to take away that they've taken for granted, or peel back the taken for granted, and look more closely at the decisions that individuals make. Another more sobering case in point, this one from New Brunswick. As part of his outreach efforts, University President Eddie Campbell, some of whom you may know, speaks in high schools across New Brunswick as part of his outreach effort. He's trying to encourage people to stay and to study in the province. Dr. Campbell says that it's fairly commonplace to see less than 25% of the student body responding positively to his message, largely because they have no plans to be in the province in 5 years. And I suspect you see something similar to that in a lot of Atlantic provinces. These young people have not yet really tried to attach themselves to the labor market, yet they cite the lack of opportunity as the main reason they're leaving. I suspect that many of you in the audience tonight would have similar experiences in your own province. In fact, unless you live in Ontario, Alberta, or British Columbia, I think it's very likely that you do. Back to New Brunswick again. Nearly 7% of all people born in New Brunswick live in Ontario. So to get a sense of the amount of movement that has gone on over time, these numbers, I think, really bring the point home. It's also, as a social demographer interested in migration, one of the primary reasons I think it's important to study labor mobility. Why do individuals choose to engage in long-distance commuting rather than taking a job close to home or picking up and leaving their province of birth? Why do some people fly to Fort McMurray instead of moving there or staying close by and accepting a local job? Is it the community they're in? Is it the household? What exactly produces the mobile laborer? Regardless of what it is, big business is there to help. In the past summer in Fredericton, there were 2 job markets, each of them attended by well over 1,500 people. The first was for highly skilled workers who wanted to move to Alberta. The second was for low-skilled workers that wanted to move to Alberta. And they were attended in equal number. It's possible that to understand these things, we need to look at intersectionality. So the intersection of individual and community or household characteristics to understand the process. So if an individual in the same context as someone else makes different decisions, then we might start to think that there's a differential impact of various factors on the decisions that they make. At least in Newfoundland and Labrador, Our preliminary research suggests so far that this is the case because men, on average, are 3 times more likely than women to travel a minimum distance one way of 200 kilometers to work. So over 6% of all men in Newfoundland travel over 200 kilometers to work. Once we adjust for differences in age, education, presence of children, occupation, industry, and a whole host of other factors that are known to affect mobility, men are still 37% more likely to make that big travel, the big commute, 200 plus kilometers. Given how big this difference is, one of the things we want to look at is how community and household characteristics affect labor mobility. We know that individual characteristics matter because many of the researchers up here and elsewhere have shown that to be the case, but what about the interaction of spouse, household, and community? We will use the census for our analysis. That will be the primary set of data sets. And despite all of the weaknesses, our choice to use the census is largely because it is the best, or was the best, existing data source out there, particularly the long-form census. And in addition to what I've already promised that we'll do for the project, we will also rank all Canadian communities in terms of their ERGM prevalence, so the propensity to produce mobile labor. We'll use this we'll use the long-form census for this as well, because once again, it's the best data source we have. We'll identify which communities produce workers for export, and we'll map where these workers come from and where they go. Part of our motivation for doing this is to bring ERGM to the national stage, so that, among other things, regions that have been shown to be economic stalwarts can be shown to be vibrant and economically productive. This is important in a place like Newfoundland and Labrador and in New Brunswick, where I'm from, for at least 2 reasons. First, it will help correct any misperceptions that that other parts of Canada might have about areas like Newfoundland, Labrador, New Brunswick, etc. And second, it helps with developing a portfolio of extant skills so that when opportunity strikes, as it has here in recent years, we can have a clearer sense of where the labor shortages are and what needs to be done to prevent them or to address them. Thank you.
Okay, thank you very much, Barb, for the invitation to be on the panel. It's always a pleasure to be back visiting Newfoundland. It's one of my favorite places. It's also a pleasure to be part of this project because it connects to so many of the themes that we've been working on in northern BC. For those of you who know northern BC, it's a landscape filled with small communities, resource-dependent economies, aging workforces, job losses, population outmigration, those sorts of issues. I want to talk in particular about some work that we've been doing in Mackenzie, a small forest-dependent community in north-central British Columbia. It was built in the 1980s from scratch to support a new forest industry in the region and a very robust economy for 30 plus years. But in 2008, every single one of the sawmill and pulp mill operations closed. There was not a job to be had in the community. And so a huge number of workers who had never before had to commute outside the community for work now found themselves engaging in long-distance labor commuting. So we went to the community over the better part of a year to meet with as many of these people as possible. We had surveys in the community, interview work, and what I'd like to do is share with you a little bit about what some of those workers were telling us about the impacts on themselves. We also asked about impacts on the community, impacts on the local economy, and other things, but this is just impacts on the workers themselves. So one of the first things that they talked about in a positive sense was, of course, the economic benefit of finding jobs when there were no jobs in their community and the importance of that income for their families. They also talked about some capacity and skills opportunities for themselves to make themselves a more better equipped worker into the future. So additional training, additional ticketing, additional supervisory duties that they were all given in different settings helped them grow those skills. They grew their networks and contacts so that they're able to search better for work opportunities moving into the future. And just shifting sector challenged a lot of the fundamentals about how they did their work previously in the forestry sector. Learning transferable skills, developing new communications tools, adopting new forms of conflict resolution skills, and working in a team environment in many settings, which weren't very typical of the older forestry structure. They were also able to access different types of services. All of those they felt were very positive impacts on themselves as workers that they could carry with them when they shifted work again, and many returned to the community once the mills were up and running. But they also identified for themselves a series of pretty significant challenges that long-distance labor commuting entailed. One of them was, of course, the antithesis of the first benefit, and that's the fiscal costs. Maintaining two households, and in many cases, backfilling the expenses of commuting that weren't covered by company policy from their new work sites. They also talked a great deal about safety concerns, personal safety concerns, especially in cases where they were doing driving commuting, and they would often do those drives in the winter, over mountains, and when they're suffering the fatigue of a long time out in the workplace. Very concerned about safety issues. And they also talked a good deal about the emotional impacts on themselves and their families. So the sense of being lonely, distant from family, the stress that can come about when something is going wrong with your children and you're too far to reach them. They talked about burnout and fatigue by working so many hours, and they talked a good deal about how their days off were now being spent paying bills, running errands, and fixing things around the house. So even then, there really wasn't any downtime. They talked a good deal about health impacts, personal health impacts, more frequent sickness, disrupted sleep patterns, depression, these sorts of challenges. And then, of course, as alluded to by some of the other speakers, there were the more general household impacts that they were affected by. The rotating of routines. When there's one household caregiver, things were stable. When the other household caregiver came, everything was changed, and there was a different routine in place, and then that second caregiver would disappear, and they'd be back to the first structure. And that rotating over and over and over and over again was very challenging for the household, and challenging as well for the spouse who remained, who had to not only continue to navigate those transitions, but also maintain all the rest of the tasks and duties during the interim periods. They had suites of recommendations to make this process work a little bit easier. The first set of recommendations they spoke to involved the workplace, so their corporate policies and actions. The idea about shift structure, shift scheduling can be structured so that they make the long-distance commute easier, more viable. Differential benefits packages so that things could more easily accommodate both themselves and the families at home. More attention to skills development, because after all, that was one of the big benefits that they saw. So more attention to that, more attention to how to work in teams, to work collaboratively, pay attention to on-the-job succession planning. Conflict resolution and problem-solving skills for workers who again could build up their own resume of skills. They also felt that there was a joint set of challenges needed with respect to government policy and corporate policy, particularly around workers working with extreme fatigue and releasing those extremely fatigued workers to commute home over mountains in the winter through their own vehicle. They also spoke I wanted to share some observations about government policy. In this case, one area is around the organization and visibility of supports for the families that are remaining in communities when a worker is away. Second is supports for the community and the household and the worker during those periods when the worker is back and all those activities get underway. Supports that keep the household viable and contributing to the Canadian economy more generally through things such as daycare programs, childcare, household maintenance and repair, these sorts of things. And then lastly, the need for the supports that are available, because they spoke about many supports that they had learned about when they had reached a crisis, but they're not necessarily visible at any given time in their community. So simply making visible those that are available would be a big support to workers who are challenged and may only be home for short periods of time. So it's a great pleasure to have had that opportunity to talk with the workers, start sharing their stories, and now build that work into a much deeper and broader investigation with this project headed in Newfoundland and working across the country. So thank you very much.
Hi. I'd like to focus in on a particular policy, employment insurance, which is easy to talk about in Newfoundland because everybody's very familiar with employment insurance. Sometimes I talk about employment insurance and people's eyes glaze over because it's just not relevant, but it's very relevant here. And one of the aspects, it's an example of what we want to look at in the project in terms of policies, thinking about policies that impinge on the labor market and on people's livelihoods and the extent to which they intersect with employment-related mobility and the kinds of impacts that they have. So in terms of thinking about the role of EI, we want to better understand the way EI affects people's work choices related to various forms of long-distance commuting. Have people been pushed into such mobility by difficulties in accessing EI in their traditional local labor markets? And do EI rules impact the decisions that workers make about where to base their families, whether to keep them, in this case here in Newfoundland, or whether to move them, for example, to Alberta? To what extent are mobile workers harassed by EI? And not just the workers, but how are employers affected? Because EI regulations certainly affect employers' decisions at least as much as worker decisions. I'm interested in whether there are elements of EI that reflect a norm of the stationary worker. Other work that I've done on EI has definitely shown that EI has a norm of a full-time, full-year worker. That's the worker that best suits the program. Part-time and temporary workers are penalized. But there's not been so much consideration of the added element of employment-related mobility. Are there explicit or implicit assumptions in EI about the relationship between place of work and place of residence? So in terms of EI rules that would be particularly relevant to look at in this regard, first of all, looking at eligibility. Historically, jobs that were obviously mobile and precarious were excluded from EI. So farm workers, domestics, and so on in the early days of the program weren't even part of it. We know that temporary workers and other non-standard workers are still less likely to be covered. And there's a lack of coverage for self-employed people, and I think self-employed people are also an important class of mobile workers that remain uncovered. There's also, along with that ineligibility, there's the particular requirements for new entrants and re-entrants, which make it harder to qualify. So what's the overlap there in terms of forms of perhaps temporary work that would put one in a situation to be a mobile worker and to be caught by these new entrant, re-entrant requirements? Probably the most important EI regulation that might be relevant is the differences by economic region in the hours that you need to qualify and in the length of the claim. So we have differences by region. The rationale for this is that you're more likely to lose your job in a high unemployment region, and it would be harder to find a job. Now that assumption obviously assumes that you're looking for a job in the region that you live, and it's the local labor market that's constraining you. So that does reflect some implicit assumption about a stationary worker. We've had these regionally extended benefits since '71, and we've had variable entrance requirements since '77. And this is a very rancorous topic across the country, and more so recently. As you would know, it's often interpreted region writ large. So the Atlantic region, is getting off easy with easy access to unemployment insurance or employment insurance, and compared to other regions, when in fact it's economic regions that are sub-regional that are used. But several studies since the 2008 recession have called for there to be one set of parameters for workers everywhere, both to encourage fairness by some standard and also to encourage mobility. Now, I should note that recent studies have found that EI does not reduce labor mobility, so that is probably a moot point, but in terms of popular opinion, it's still out there. The underlying assumption, therefore, seems to be of a stationary workforce, but the result of regional differences is that two people can work for the same employer in one location and face different entitlements depending on where they live. So if you live in Northern Alberta and claim EI in Northern Alberta, you will have different entitlements than if you work in Northern Alberta and come home to parts of Atlantic Canada. So in this way, the employment-related mobility interacts with EI rules, creating perhaps unforeseen incentives and outcomes. It's likely that the decision to keep one's family at home in Newfoundland and work shifts out west is influenced to some degree by this. But there's also issues around, it depends on how your normal place of residence is interpreted. You can file a claim where you live, whether or not that's where you work, but you can be challenged on this regarding whether that is indeed your normal place of residence. So I'm interested in looking at that aspect to see whether there's mobile workers have their claims challenged more than others. If you're, is it hard to make the case that you do indeed live in Newfoundland and even though you're working somewhere else, or that you live outside of St. John's and are working in St. John's. Another element of the program is the benefit and duration formulas in terms of how much you get for benefits and how long you get them. And those have been shown to be tied to notions of a standard work week, which doesn't apply in many mobile work situations. And the changes that took place in 1996 definitely hurt eligibility for many workers, and so perhaps that is a factor that's contributed to the increase in employment-related mobility that we've seen, the sort of push to leave, certainly to leave some rural areas, not just rural areas, but if you can't qualify for EI anymore, that's a push for more mobility. In terms of how your benefits calculated, the formula certainly penalizes some people. If you work intensely long hours for a short period of time, you will qualify, but you may have your benefit levels lowered because of the way that the formula works. So those are examples of some of the things that may be factors. Now, if we're going to look at changes to EI over time, since 1980, but there's one obvious change to EI that we're all talking about now, which is the omnibus bill from last spring and the changes to defining suitable employment that will come into effect in 2013. And that bill explicitly aims to increase one form of employment-related mobility, and that is the commuting distance, that you have to be willing to commute up to an hour away. It also has provisions that make it difficult for seasonal workers and other frequent claimants. So frequent claimants are distinguished from long-tenured workers and occasional claimants, and are going to face more challenges in terms of what kind of work they're expected to take. This has been roundly criticized in the Atlantic provinces and as an attack on the region and on seasonal work. And it shows little understanding of the job structure in rural communities or the challenges of commuting in rural communities. The other factor about this current change is that the government explicitly links the change to another aspect of mobility, which Pauline and others have spoken about, which is the use of temporary foreign workers. So those two are being sort of pitted against each other in this policy discussion. The implication is that local workers are available for work and can be made to take it. But the provisions will likely only serve to exacerbate the local labor market shortages, making the work even less attractive for the local workers. So how will mobile workers who are home from good seasonal jobs in another area respond to this kind of harassment? Will it make more sense to move the family rather than face harassment from EI? So those are some of the things that, most obviously link EI as the main income security program for Canadian workers with the issue of mobility. I think EI hasn't been looked at through the lens of mobility very much. And I think it does affect people's work choices related to mobility. And we want to promote a program that reflects an understanding of the complicated reality of making a living for all workers, for all types of workers, and in all types of communities. My own bias, obviously, from my examples is the situation in rural communities, which is where most of my research has been. But I know there's at least as much frustration these days with EI in what we think of as the main urban labor markets in Canada, and mobility issues cut across rural urban. So, thank you.
Right, good evening. Barb said I was going to say something about European experiences. A number of panelists have already mentioned that there are occupational health and safety issues for migrant workers. In Europe, as in most countries, it is the Labour Inspectorate or the Regulatory Inspectorate with responsibility for health and safety that is the agency of the state that is charged with trying to ensure that work and workers that workers are protected and that work does not harm health or safety. That's clearly not entirely working. So I hope this is relevant. About 18 months ago, 2 years ago, we undertook a fairly large project for the European Commission that was instigated by an organization in Europe known as the Senior Labour Inspectors Committee to look at emergent trends in the structure and organization of work and the labour market, and to try to consider how labour inspectors and labour inspectorates in the 27 member states of the European Union were responding to these new challenges. One of the areas that we identified as an emergent trend, hardly surprisingly, was labour mobility. And indeed, it was one of a number of themes that emerged and one that we looked at in some more detail. Of course, labour inspection in the European Union is very complicated. It's not the same in each country. It's complicated by different structural models, which could well impact on the nature and effectiveness of their responses to protecting migrant workers. Labour migration is generally identified by occupational health and safety specialists as a problem because it's perceived that migrant workers have more injuries or fatalities or more occupationally related ill health. And that may well be true, but it's obviously symptomatic of deeper issues in the current restructuring and repositioning of work and labour markets, and indeed the kinds of problems that many of the people on this panel have referred to are not the traditional safety or health problems in the workplace, which complicates the task of labour inspectors in trying to undertake surveillance on these sorts of issues. Despite this, we did find in our studies in Europe that there are indications that labour inspection
both recognizes and attempts to address protection for workers in this changed environment in which labour mobility is so much more significant. We identified a number of key elements in the responses of labour inspectorates to these kinds of challenges, ranging from organisational and policy responses to changed efforts to achieve compliance, to extending the reach of labour inspection to hard-to-reach situations in which many migrant workers are located, and in doing things to support their own activities within labour inspection. So, for example, in relation to the organisational and policy initiatives, we found explicit programs aimed at trying to combat social dumping. We found much greater recognition of the notion of labour mobility as defined as an emergent risk in policy statements. We found attempts to achieve better strategic coordination between labour at different aspects of labour inspection and other kinds of inspection undertaken by the state, and specific initiatives to engage with migrant workers and groups that represent migrant workers. In terms of improving compliance, we found more targeted inspection, focusing on the supervision of temporary agencies, trying to control the activities of gangmasters, going upstream in labour supply chains in order to focus on labour migration issues. And extending reach to the places where migrant workers were working, particularly in relation to small firms, foreign firms, foreign to the state that we were looking at in terms of the labour inspection, whichever one it happened to be, the role of subcontractors, and all of these situations in which there was a greater proportion of migrant workers. Labour inspectorates were aware of these kinds of situations. They were attempting to address them. We also found that in some cases there was an increased resourcing made available by the state to labour inspectorates to enable them to try to address what was perceived to be an increasing problem. But I would say that there, generally, the perception of the increased problem by the state, at least, was that it was a problem about undeclared work rather than a problem necessarily about labour migration. And the major interest, both in terms of increasing the resources of labour inspectors and increasing the resources of other forms of state inspection, was to try to recoup what was perceived as being a lost revenue from the undeclared employment of many different forms of migrant workers in the European Union. As far as what the labour inspectorates were struggling to do in order to support their own activities, we found a greater presence of international collaboration between different labour inspectorates in different member states, where a perceived common problem about a particular form of labour mobility that might be better protected was perceived. There was a greater use of information technology and those sorts of activities to improve data collection. One of the major things that we actually found looking across Europe as a whole was the paucity of information about the nature of the problems that migrant labour was confronting in many, many different situations. And we did find that there were increased provision for more specific and more appropriate training for labour inspectors. So there was no doubt that there are innovative approaches taking place in the European Union to try to address these issues. However, it must be said that such approaches are relatively few and far between across the whole spectrum of labour inspection in the European Union. There are many, many gaps. There is no really coherent policy being rolled out in terms of labour inspection strategy at a supranational level within the European Union. And I think you also have to set these findings against the wider problem, which is that for most labour inspectorates in the European Union today, the primary concern that they're experiencing is one of a significant reduction in their resourcing and their capacity to address these very important issues. Thank you.
Well, thank you, panel. I'm Rob Greenwood with the Harris Centre and Office of Public Engagement. Lots of food for thought with 7-minute presentations. It's kind of a taster menu. You'd swear I didn't get supper tonight, but to continue with this, now you get to tuck in. We have loads of stuff to dig in there, and there's lots of expertise in the room and on the panel. We have a couple of mics in the room, and you put your hand up, and I will keep track of who puts their hand up, more or less in order. And we'll get the mic to you. You can say who you are. One right here to begin with, Amy. And say who you are, and then briefly comment, question, because it's really in the back and forth, the dialogue. You can address your question to a particular panelist, or you can throw it out there, and we'll see who wants to jump in. With 7 panelists, I won't expect them all to comment on every question, but if you're really eager, I'll let you jump in. And we also, of course, have people viewing live on the internet. And Morgan, I think, will put his hand up whenever he gets a question in, and we'll intersperse them with the ones in the audience. And we'll go to 9:25, and we'll give you time for a final wrap-up response to questions, if we can, across the panel by 9:25. So, the floor is yours, sir.
My name is Dennis Mulcahy, and I'm in the Faculty of Education. And rural education and schooling is the object and subject of my research. I came here tonight because one of the things that I'm interested in is the consequences on school children of this topic that you're focusing on here. I become aware of this through my interaction with my graduate students online, and they talk about the fact that in most communities it is the dad that is mobile, goes away for 6 weeks or whatever. Sometimes it's the mom, sometimes it's both. Mom and dad are gone, and that makes an interesting situation because who looks after the kids? I was interested to discover that sometimes it's a grandparent and sometimes it's an older sibling. And I've become very interested, well, what are the consequences of that? And what's emerged from my inquiry so far is that this absenteeism has motivational factors in terms of the kids. It has academic consequences for the kids. It has behavioral consequences for the kids. It also has a kind of, because most of the people who are commuting are making very good money, so when they come home to compensate for their absence, they'll often buy kids lots of stuff. And part of the message the kids are getting that, maybe we don't have to stay in school. We can go and get one of these big jobs in Alberta as well. One side thing I have to share with you, a couple of my female students who are doing their graduate degree, they love it when their husband goes away. They're able to concentrate on their work more and organize their household without any interference, as they say. I just have one question to ask. As I think most of us in this room know, this mobility of learning is nothing new for Newfoundland. I mean, there was a whole bunch of people in the Burin Peninsula laid track out west. A lot of people in other parts of the province worked on the lake boats. And of course, Conception Bay was known for its iron workers. They helped build the World Trade Towers, among others. And one of the questions that I've been debating with my students, like, are there more long-distance workers now than there used to be in Newfoundland, or is it the same? And I don't have an answer to that question, so my question is to the panel, like, where are we in terms of, in Newfoundland, do we have more people commuting back and forth to their jobs, the same as always, less? What is the situation? Thanks, Rob.
Super, thanks. And who would like to jump in on that in terms of what you know already and or what you plan to know in relation to what was just said?
I can quickly comment.
Yep, you should be on.
I don't know for Newfoundland. It's something that we will look into. Overall, for the country, there has not been a huge change. It's bounced up and down based on the labor cycle or the business cycle. So between 1991 and 2006, we really haven't seen a sustained pattern. But it is something I'll look at for Newfoundland. I wouldn't be surprised if there were differences across provinces.
Yeah, but I'm talking about the traditional Newfoundland. I'm going back to the beginning of the 20th century. And maybe
Right.
we've been sending people away to work for a long time.
No, up the top with the blue coat will be next. But before we do, Greg and I noticed our sound man has color coding on your mic. So the blue mic is next.
Am I blue?
Everything Greg says isn't blue, but
So I don't have a number to share for you, but I have a unexpected policy consequence. Very powerful story. Principal walks into a hallway and tells me the story. So what happens, a teacher walked into the hall, and there was a young boy on the floor crying. So she went up to the young boy and said, "What's the matter, young man?" And he said, "Well, my dad was home on the weekend. We had just a great time, but now he's gone away, and he's not going to be back for a while, and I really miss him." And so the teacher tried to comfort him and said, "Well, I understand what you mean. My husband was home over the weekend, and we had a wonderful time, and now he's gone away and won't be back for quite a bit." So the principal walks into the hallway, and there's the teacher and the young student both crying on the floor in the hallway. The unexpected policy implications are that for the school district, they did not understand the degree to which they would have to cope with the stresses in the household and the stresses on the individuals. The teachers' union and the school district did not understand the degree to which teachers would be caregivers, or that the caregivers could burn out and would need respite care. For counselors and other healthcare professionals, there was a respite care program put in place, but not for the teachers. And so a series of consequences for policy to support the community and the individual from that story.
thanks, Greg. I think Nora was going to jump in, the red mic.
In the last census, it was the first time that we began to sense the significance of the skip generation, where grandparents are looking after their children. The downside of that is that we're still only getting a small piece of that. So we don't have sort of the data from the long term, but we do have lots of stories from the long term. In the work that I've done with employers, one of the things that we looked at for international relocation was what was successful. And we found out that the number one factor contributing to success of a long distance relocation was the presence of a supportive family. The number one negative consequence that contributed to the failure of a long distance commute or a long distance transfer was the presence of a depressed, upset, angry, disgruntled family. But family was the number one thing that either made it or not. So I think that teachers and community groups have a lot of work to do to understand the significance of mobility, and that's not just the 6 weeks, 6 months shifts, but there's a lot of other things that we need to look at as well. The 2-hour commutes, not being there to do the homework. Kids are asleep. When they get up, the parents are gone. So there's lots of issues around childcare and parenting that we need to take a serious look at.
Pauline, I think, wants to jump in, the yellow mic, and I'll stop saying that after a while.
Just very quickly, this has been a huge issue in the Philippines, and a lot of work is being done on it, but flipping it over to the Canadian side, there's also the question of family reunification when, for example, live-in caregivers who come to Canada come alone and must live in for 2 years prior to their, to claim eligibility for permanent resident status. So there's reunification happening on this side too, not just the split at the other end. And as I said, there's work being done on this throughout the country where there are concentrations of caregivers. There's been a fair amount of work done in BC, so that's something we can look into further.
I wondered if we'd be able to keep Barb in her seat, but you take my mic just for a minute.
Chrissy Vincent and I did a review of the literature looking at the relationship between work scheduling and parent-child relationships. So there is a public manuscript on that. And there actually isn't a lot of research, I don't think, on the issue that you're looking at, but I can send you that manuscript.
We do have another question, but anyone burning to get in on this one? Good. Lady with the blue jacket, can introduce yourself.
Hi, I'm Susan Shirk, and I work for AMIC Environment and Infrastructure. 40 years ago, I spent 10 years documenting the province and various aspects of it. And what I was struck by at that time was the lack of people living, males, primarily living in communities, whole communities, where the men had gone away to work. It didn't matter whether it was on freighters or draggers, or on the Great Lakes, or in the forest industry, or in New York, or whatever, but they were gone. The point that I'd like to make on this is anybody looking at the comparative literature of the previous huge out-migrations for mobility that took place, has always taken place in this province, and is this, it was alluded to already, is this any greater, and what were the coping mechanisms back at that time? Because I think it would be an interesting comparison. It's the first thing. The second thing is I'm not involved, this has been unintended consequences of work I do now, where I've seen things that are so different from 40 years ago. And that is, and again it's been alluded to, the amount of money that is now coming into the communities, rural communities in Newfoundland. But it's not all over, of course. It's because families follow brothers, sisters, etc. So you've got communities where there's large pockets of money coming in because people have attachment to home and they're not moving up to Fort McMurray or wherever, but they're spending all of their money in Newfoundland. And if you go to communities, Lewisport comes to mind, where, as an example, Lewisport Wholesalers was a big distribution warehouse for the Labrador. When the supply boats going up to Labrador stopped, that changed, they had these huge warehouses in Lewisport. Today they are filled with very expensive RVs, big yachts, motorboats, fancy cars. I even saw a Maserati there. The place is crammed with this. You then go further down and you will see your $1 million homes. You go up to Anchor Point, you're seeing warehouses also filled with these wonderful toys. So the amount of money that's now being earned by tradespeople, by unemployed, and by skilled workers, I'd love to know if it's higher proportionally than it used to be, and is there more wealth coming back to this province than there used to be when people were going away to look in other places. The question of whether that kind of research, because I think it's important to see how people are spending their money and how communities benefit. And I'd also like to know whether this phenomena of attachment to community in Newfoundland is prevalent in Nova Scotia or New Brunswick or some of the other places, or whether this is something special to this part. Thank you. The other thing I also wanted to ask is, Michael, the long form, can we really rely on that? It's now voluntary. Yeah.
The response rates are below 70%, and at the provincial level, once you zoom down into rural urban areas, it can be much lower. So, I don't know if I've answered your question, but I think I sort of have.
Yeah, I think it's really sad.
It's difficult.
Thank you, Susan. And Amy Morgan will have one emailed in next. But before we get to that, lots of stuff for the panel to consider to respond to there. And Barb, if you want to jump up, you can. Who'd like to go first on this one?
I'm happy to start off,
Okay.
and then Barb, you'll be able to say. One really great thing about this project that we're all a part of is that we actually can do that kind of hooking up. So I'm doing research in the Fort McMurray, and I would like to know what's happening over here as well, because those same toys that you mentioned, the yachts and everything, find those parked in all the driveways in the suburbs of Fort McMurray as well. And so I think where that money's moving and depending on what kind of mobile worker people are, right, that will make a difference in terms of how much money they have. There's also the retirees moving back here, of course, as well, who went in the 1970s and are now moving back here to live, and they can sell their house for 10 times what they bought it for in Fort McMurray. So you've got all of these different factors that I think are contributing to that wealth, but also to how it's in different pockets, and I think that's an important thing for us to think about.
Other comments from the panel?
Just to build briefly on Sarah's comment about the baby boomers. Newfoundland's baby boom was Newfoundland and Labrador's baby boom was approximately 200,000 people. About half of them left. New Brunswick, 300,000 people, half left. Nova Scotia, around the same as New Brunswick. So we have, out in the rest of Canada and the world, at least 500,000 Atlantic Canadians out there earning money, doing well. I looked at census data and compared the outcomes of those that moved to other parts of Canada versus those that stayed put. Those that left did overwhelmingly better. Now, whether that was a context thing or whether they created their own fortunes, I mean, that's open to debate. But now, as baby boomers hit the age of retirement, we see return migration. And Sarah mentioned it briefly, but I think it is a huge factor. Places like Miramichi and even Lewisport, I'm sure you see that all the time.
Other responses? Barb?
One of the things we do want to look at is remittances. It is, there is a whole literature on remittances when you look at international temporary foreign work, but we actually don't have any data. And so it's not just money, but objects. So are people where are they buying the objects that you're seeing? Are they buying them here? Are they buying them where they're working? Are they driving them back? And so on and so forth. So that is a central, because it has to do with community level impacts. Of course, the other thing that could well be coming back is not so nice, right? It's drugs, it's those kinds of issues. And so when you have a highly rural community, you could have a pretty major drug problem developing pretty quickly and absolutely no institutional supports in that rural area for dealing with drug issues.
And I can say for a fact you can't buy a new Maserati in Lewisport. But I'm almost positive you can buy drugs. But that's an assumption. Any others on the panel? Oh, good. Okay, we have Morgan, and then Amy, we have a lady in the blue up on the left after Morgan.
Thanks, Rob. A short and sweet one from Twitter. Reggie Marsden's wondering, and maybe you can't speak to this specifically, but in general, how does unemployment rates in Newfoundland affect the number of migrant workers from Newfoundland to Alberta?
Martha?
I assume it affects them a lot, affects it a lot. But one of the things, I did some work with Peter Sinclair and Deirdre Walsh on, the unemployment rates are a bit hard to figure out at the moment because the unemployment rate is high, but the talk is of labor shortages. So it's not that it's that there's jobs elsewhere. I think definitely more people go when the unemployment rates are high, but there's still issues, with not enough available labor for the jobs that are there. So there's a lot of mismatch kinds of employment issues going on.
Others on that one?
I would just quickly add that I think that also that what you just mentioned in terms of the mismatch, I think it's also about seasonality of work as well. And, the seasons for particular kinds of work in the oil patch and how those match up and don't match up with seasonal work here. And I think that's another really important piece of our puzzle.
Just to add to that, that's one of the problems with this new omnibus bill, because they had figures of how many temporary foreign workers were approved and matching them up with unemployed fish plant workers, in the middle of January. Well, those foreign workers are approved for the same season that those fish plant workers are going to be back to work.
Okay. The floor is yours.
Sorry. I'm Niraz. I'm a PhD student in the Department of Anthropology in MUN. I'm from Bangladesh, so I don't have much knowledge about what's going on in Newfoundland, but I know about people migrating from my country to all over the world, and we're one of the most densely populated country in the world. What I have like 3 concerns. One is about oil sands, Sarah, like oil industry in the Middle East specifically, where like I think among the migrants in the Middle East, Bangladeshis are a huge proportion, and most of them are not allowed to bring in their families and to settle there ever. So that has huge impact, huge social impact on the families back home. Like kids never get to see their dads, and wives are without their husbands all the time. So families are broken sometimes, families are just disrupted. So I think that needs to be looked at when you're looking at the international picture. The other thing I wanted to talk about is the opportunities to migration. Like I think to be able to find a job elsewhere, you have to have a social network, economic and social ability to go. So how does that affect people who go from here to elsewhere? And are you looking into that as well? Thank you.
Thank you very much. And Amy, it'll come back to Morgan then. John's getting off easy tonight. Okay, and we got 2 more after that. So on the panel for that question or comment. Greg?
So I can only go at the second question. And absolutely critical, what we saw was that the most skilled, the most capable people were the ones who were able to secure employment first when it came time for that community to start looking for work outside. And so what was often left was something of a remnant population struggling. For community groups and other groups, of course, it meant that their daily functioning was impacted because of the loss on a daily basis of community leaders, some highly skilled individuals, and those sorts of things. So you're absolutely right. We saw the role of networks, personal skills, capacity, social capital, social cohesion being exercised by people to find work, and those who were most capable ended up going quite quickly. It had a number of implications for possibilities for employment by those who weren't so quick off the mark, and second, implications for the viability of the community and its organizations when the loss of so many community, we'll just use the term leaders, were missing.
Thanks, Greg. And Pauline, I think.
Yeah, I mean, I'm speaking to you because you asked a question about international or transnational migration, and for sure, every issue you raise is critical. The networks are thick and deep, and one of the things that networks are mobilized for is information about migration pathways, but also earlier we were speaking about remittances. A lot of international labor migrants go into debt in order to migrate, and even when calculations are done around remittances, debt is often not factored in, or indebtedness is not factored in. So if you'll forgive me, there's a kind of neoliberal sort of policy agenda at play here. And one of the things that is being said about global migration is that it's a way out of national indebtedness for countries like Bangladesh and the Philippines and so on. And so there's a lot of talk about migration and development, migration as development. Temporary foreign work is supposed to be a win-win-win, win for the countries that send, win for the countries that receive, and win for the migrants themselves. But none of this takes account of questions of debt, of family fragmentation, of disrupted lives, and so on. So your point is very relevant, and I would say that all of these issues apply in internal migration scenarios as well. It's just the scale perhaps is different, and precarity is different because the regulations that govern those 2 forms of migration or 2 sites of migration are are different. They don't always cross borders. Yeah.
Thank you. Others on this one? Yep. Sarah?
Talk about the oil sands a bit. With regard to temporary foreign workers and their families not being with them, yes, as Ramazan could also tell us, I mean, that's a big stress. I think what's important about, there are a number of things that are important about that. I mean, one is obviously the distance from them and from their families. But I think the second thing is we found in our research that a lot of people who were on what they called the 3 to 5 year plan, right, in Fort McMurray, who were there with their families. Families were often your network into the community as well, right? Through children, through children's networks, through schools. And so for temporary foreign workers, not only are there often more precarious positions in being tied to their employers through contracts, having more stringent certification requirements, a number of kind of stressors, but not having families there meant also it was harder then to kind of find connections into the community. On the other hand, the community in Fort McMurray is to some degree working hard to try to bring temporary foreign workers, connect them in through volunteer opportunities, through activities, but it's a really difficult thing to do. Yeah, I'll just leave it there. Thank you.
Okay. I think what we'll do now, we have one emailed in that Morgan will do. John, you can bring the mic down to the lady in the red sweater at the front, and then after her, it's the lady in the black vest after that. And what I'll do is not get you to respond after each of these, but I'm going to start with David and work our way back, so you can keep track of the questions, respond to the ones you want, and that'll be also your closing comments. Morgan from the internet.
Thanks, Rob. Another short and sweet one from Twitter, from City Region Studies, and Nora kind of touched on this in her talk. What is the prevalence of same-sex couples who are mobile workers, and what implications, if any, are there for their families in particular?
Okay, thank you. Hi. Okay.
Gotta wait for a second. Okay, great. Thanks very much. My name's Deetra Walsh. I live here in Newfoundland, and I'm a postdoc fellow at York, so I live somewhat of a mobile life as well. So my question, just with regards to policy, and I'm thinking about what Pauline said in the example that Mike gave in terms of people not necessarily recognizing things. At what level do people recognize policy navigation in labor mobility? And what I mean here is, are people likely to be explicit about the role of policy and the way that affects their decision making? And adjacent to that, would that be less likely in internal labor mobility? Less likely to be explicit, and I'm thinking, Pauline, a little bit to your work. And if that's the case, how do we get at those policy dimensions? And Greg gave us some great examples as well, so I'm curious to know, were you explicit in your questions to those migrant workers about the policy dimensions? Thank you.
Thank you, Deetra. And John is strategically placed there. Last question.
Yes. I'm Diane Looker, and I'm a sociologist who's been at Acadia and Mount St. Vincent University, and I study a lot of issues related to youth and youth mobility. And I'm really giving a comment that's an answer to the question that came earlier about the effect of unemployment rates. One of the things in terms of looking at higher education, one of the things we've known for some time is that when unemployment goes up, more students pursue post-secondary education. When there's more jobs available, they exit post-secondary education. So it's really important to look at the relationship between employment and presumably getting skills and increasing your human capital, but it's also basically getting you out of the labor force. So it's not employment-related long-term mobility, but it may still be long-term mobility, but it certainly is one of the documented responses to high employment rates in this area and elsewhere in Canada.
Thank you. Okay, so each of you can have 1 or 2 minutes to respond to any of those comments or questions, starting with David.
I think that, again, it seems to me that the issues around the policy kinds of components of this are extremely difficult to try to tease out. I'm not sure that I can't speak either for the Newfoundland or the Canadian experience generally, but that is an issue in Europe particularly, and I think that the approach there is perhaps to try to turn it around and to look at it from the situation of the nature of the problem, first define the problem, and then to look at where does that pan out in terms of is it a problem that is related to the policy? Should there be a new policy? How do those things relate together? And again, in terms of how that relates to strategy, and going back to what I was talking about earlier, it seems to me that most of the major problems that we identify as concerns for migrant workers, whether they're emotional stress, fatigue, the consequences therein for safety, whether they are issues around work-life balance, whatever they are, it doesn't seem to me that states are particularly well provided in relation to strategic responses to these problems. We're still stuck in a kind of conventional time warp in that respect. We know how to respond to the old problems, we don't know how to respond to the new. And I think that if this research does anything, it will help to inform the possible responses for the future. That's all.
Thanks, David. Martha, responses, closing comments.
Just a response to Deirdre's question about to what extent people recognize policy incentives. I think they're very good at recognizing policies that actually do impact on or that they experience. So in terms of EI, for example, the knowledge of the ins and outs and minutiae of EI in a community dependent on EI is fabulous. It's better than anything in the academic literature in terms of how that program actually plays out on the ground, but that, that does impact them. A policy, an occupational health policy, perhaps, or workers' comp. I mean, maybe you don't run into that till you've run into it, and then, boy, then you learn what it means for you. But I think in terms of field work, sometimes you can learn what the policies are that they are aware of and that are operating. They may be some things that we haven't even thought of. So it's sort of a two-way street, the things we think they should be taking into account, and are they? But there may be things they are taking into account that aren't even on our radar yet. And Diane, in terms of the education and unemployment and employment, we certainly, in a project we were doing on the west coast of Newfoundland, we were looking at, one of the things we looked at was the educational institutions and the responses and, where students seem to be going. And they're definitely responding to the skills and so on that are in demand, out west and in other places in terms of what kinds of training they're going after. And, trades training versus university training. And the institutions themselves are also getting into it. So it's the same way that the Philippines, I guess, trains nurses to go all over the world. Educational institutions here are marketing programs that will be useful for kids to take and go away.
Okay.
Work away.
Thank you. 6 minutes. Greg, closing comments.
Thanks. So just a couple of observations to close. First, great questions. Shows everyone's filled with curiosity about where this is situated. I think the questions about historical context are really, really important relative to where we are now, because we sit at a very curious moment in time. There is a tremendous upswing in a suite of massive industrial resource development projects in Canada that demand a huge amount of labor, but they are occurring almost exactly coincident with the graying of a baby boomer workforce, and a workforce that had through most of its life been able to operate with a relatively limited skill set. So we have a historical case, we have this current moment in time, and I think it will be interesting to see forward over the 7 years of this work how your questions also get translated forward in time to what we might call the next 2 generations of the next economy workforces. In the next decade, what will long-distance labor commuting look like when we're really in the throes of a retiring baby boom front wave? And then secondly, in 25 to 35 years, when the skilled baby boom population that will work well into its 70s actually seriously consider stepping away from the labor market. That next generation workforce in 25 to 30 years is not yet born. And how are we going to get ready to grow that learning workforce in this context? So all great questions. The policy issues, of course, speak clearly to that concern looking historically now and into the future, because when we talk to people about policy, they see these superficial policies. They want their sawmill reopened, so damn it, allocate more wood to it. That should sound quite familiar to a maritime context. Secondly, they know the policies that assist them to be mobile, but they rarely talk about the underlying structural transition in public policy and global economic policy that has allowed this sort of vulnerability to resource, corporate, industry, community, demographic transition all to be colliding right now.
Okay, short snappers, almost out of time. Michael. Under pressure.
Yeah.
Come on, Mike.
I'm sorry. I'll quickly respond to Deirdre. The idea of policy incentives. Individuals may respond to policy incentives, but it will depend on the nature of the incentives. So if you give somebody $50 to have another child, they're unlikely to respond to it. But if you give them $50,000, they are. So there's often a tendency to conflate the idea of response to an incentive versus the nature of the incentive. When it comes to recruiting and retaining individuals, preventing permanent migration, we have very good data. The census, we lost the long form. We still have the short form, so we have a good idea of where people are going and where they're not going. We don't have the same kind of data for labor mobility at all, so we don't know if an individual would respond to a provincial tax credit, for example, to keep them in their home province rather than leaving outright. Would that work? Possibly, but we don't have the data to set up to test it yet. Closing comments, it sort of builds on what I just mentioned. We're living in a world of data gaps, and one of the biggest areas is in the area, I believe, is in the area of labor mobility. It would be ideal if we could get some information on where individuals actually move on a more regular basis. Even the census, which I keep saying is the best that we have, it measures individuals in May. Once a year, once every 5 years. We don't really know where they're going. We could rely on other data sources that Statistics Canada keeps, like the Labour Force Survey, but an individual in the Labour Force Survey that's found in a place like Alberta, their questionnaire is actually mailed back to New Brunswick because their place of residence is New Brunswick. And additionally, there are only 2,800 people in the whole province of New Brunswick, so the sample sizes are a bit of an issue. One more comment quickly. This shouldn't deter us from doing this kind of research, because people within Statistics Canada and beyond have been incredibly innovative with coming up with new ways to measure and answer questions of interest. So one example I can give you, when you fill out your when you receive a health card, all of your information is stored in a database. It's maintained as an administrative database by the Department of Health. So if you're in Newfoundland, there's a database that's set up to keep track of all your medical information. When you leave Newfoundland, if you leave Newfoundland, your new province has a responsibility to mail back your health card and tell Newfoundland that you no longer require health services. Part of what they send with that parcel is your new postal code. So now, we lost the long-form census. It's not possible for us to study mobility in the same way, but now this Medicare database, for entirely unintentional purposes, allows us to study where people are going. So, creativity. That wasn't my idea, it was someone else's, but creativity really does breed invention.
Thanks, Michael. Pauline.
Just quickly on the international piece, there's a lot of information in the Philippines circulates about the consequences of different migratory pathways. So I would say for skilled workers, there's a good deal of knowledge, and I would even hazard a guess that a better knowledge base exists about Canadian immigration policy in the Philippines than exists inside Canada. In terms of employment-related mobility and education, again, migration in a way, Philippine migration begets migration. So remittance money is spent on educating a new generation of labor migrants who are heading towards more skilled labor markets, but again, this value degradation that I referred to seems to happen in many different sites. So it's quite complicated. And of course, there are always going to be migrants who get it wrong and who end up in terrible trouble because they've misunderstood policy, or the labor brokers and recruitment industry has got its dark side as well, which the Philippine state works very hard to correct. Lots more to say, but I'll leave it there. Good questions, and I like the way you know, the international side of things can so productively help the dialogue around our internal processes as well.
Thank you. Sarah.
Okay, quick question, or a quick response to the question about same-sex couples. Thank you for the question, because the assumption of heterosexual families and heterosexual people here is problematic. Fort McMurray is a hard place to be out. We interviewed a couple of people who identified as gay and lesbian, but we did not actually interview any couples. But I think that's a really important question to ask in relation especially to a context where it's hard to be out. And how does that intersect with mobility? On the question about policy incentives, this isn't my area, but one thing that really that I thought of when you asked the question was the way in which certain policy incentives to try to keep mobile workers can actually have an impact on communities. So in Fort McMurray, for example, living out allowances and housing bonuses that are given out by industry to try to entice people to not just come but stay has a real impact on the community because it helped to increase housing costs. It caused havoc in terms of finding housing and providing housing. So I think it's important to think about how those policies travel, not just individuals but into communities as well.
Thank you, Sarah. Nora, last word.
An extraordinary beginning to an extraordinary project. 4 C's: collaboration, creativity, curiosity, and conversation. And we've only just begun. Looking forward to the next several years to answer all of those questions and take all of those ideas and get some really solid information and transfer that knowledge, not just within the populations that we're talking about now, but to other groups like military families and immigrant families and diverse families. It's just the beginning. It's a great start.
Lovely wrap-up. Thank you. A couple of quick comments before we show our appreciation. Please fill in your evaluations if you're in the room. It's really important we get that. Leave them on the table here on your way out. If you're on the web, you can click on the bottom of the screen and take a few seconds, fill it in there. Some quick thank yous. Thanks to Barb in her never-ending manner of pulling a fantastic project together, partnering once again with the Harris Center, with the On the Move partnership. It's just, as you say, a sign of things to come. It's going to be great on really critical issues that this province and I know other places are wrestling with. Thanks again, as always, to Distance Education, Learning and Teaching Support. The camera crew do a fantastic job. John Bunnell and his team. This will be webcast or broadcast live. It will be broadcast, not live, on the Rogers Cable TV network in the Northeast Avalon region of Newfoundland numerous times. And we archive these on the Harris Center website. And we're hearing increasingly how faculty at Memorial are using these as a teaching resource. So this will be used repeatedly, and we know governments are using the web broadcast as well as the recording for policy input. So just the start, but lots of mobilization happening. Thanks a million to the people in the audience. There's lots of competing things to do once you hit December, and so it just shows a sign of the interest, and especially also the people viewing on the web. And please join me in thanking the panel for a fantastic job, and I will present them with gifts when we clue up. Thanks a lot. And if you're in the room, please join us for the reception out that way and down to the lobby, and we'll follow Amy and company to make sure we get there. Thanks a lot.